The champagne flute shattered against my forehead before anyone in that room could move to stop her. Glass caught the light, then caught my skin, and a thin line of blood slid down past my eyebrow and into my collar. 25 guests stood frozen with their drinks halfway to their mouths while my daughter-in-law turned to face them, smoothed the front of her dress, and announced in a calm, almost gentle voice that I was confused, that I had been confused for some time, and that the family was now looking into a care facility. My own son said nothing. He stared at the carpet as if he could disappear into it. Only my 7-year-old granddaughter moved. She ran across that crowded room toward me, until her father caught her and carried her away. I stood there with blood on my face and a smile aimed at me like a knife, and I asked myself one question that would not let go. Why were these two people so desperate to make an entire room believe I had lost my mind? The answer, when I finally found it, would cost them their marriage, their careers, and very nearly their freedom. Her name was Vanessa, and she did not apologize. She did not even pretend to be sorry. She set down the broken stem of the glass on a side table, dabbed once at the corner of her own eye as though she were the one who had been wounded, and repeated the words she wanted everyone to remember, confused. My son Bryce stood beside her with his hands hanging useless at his sides, 30-some years old, a practicing attorney, and he could not lift his eyes to look at his bleeding father. Then little Lily broke loose. She crossed the whole length of that dining room in her small party shoes and grabbed my hand with both of hers. "Grandpa, you're bleeding," she whispered, and her face was so afraid that it nearly broke me where the glass had not. Vanessa snapped her fingers one sharp sound and said her name like a command. Lily. Bryce obeyed before his own daughter did. He lifted her into his arms and turned away while she stretched one hand back toward me over his shoulder, fingers opening and closing in the air, and standing there, dripping onto a stranger's white tablecloth. I finally understood that this was not only cruelty, this was preparation. They were teaching a room full of important people to believe that I could no longer be trusted with my own life. I excused myself to the powder room down the hall. I pressed a folded towel against the cut and looked at the man in the mirror, really looked at him, for the first time in a long while, 71 years old. A man who had built a company out of nothing, who had buried the only woman he ever loved, who had carried his grief quietly so it would not become anyone else's burden. And somehow that same man had let a stranger walk into his family and slowly close every door. She had canceled my time with Lily. She had taken over decisions about my own property. She had convinced my son, day by day, that his father was becoming a problem to be managed instead of a man to be respected. The blood on my collar made it impossible to keep lying to myself. Vanessa was not stressed. She was not protective. She was clearing me out of the way. And she was almost finished. I went back into the dining room, told everyone I had simply suffered a dizzy spell, and that I was sorry to have worried them. Vanessa gave me a small, satisfied smile, the smile of someone watching a plan work exactly as designed. Bryce still would not meet my eyes. I gathered my coat, said my goodnights, and walked out into the cold. I had a house 3 hours east in Wilmington, near the water, and I drove there through the dark with a gas station bandage over my eyebrow. I had spent 38 years turning one small lumberyard into 17 locations across 2 states. I had paid for Bryce's college, his law school, his wedding, and the very house where I had just been struck in front of strangers. And yet, somewhere out on that empty highway, with the heater humming and the lines on the road sliding past, I felt something I had not felt in years. I was not confused. I was not grieving. I was not afraid. For the first time in a very long time, I was completely awake. For 3 years, I had explained Vanessa's behavior away. Stress, I told myself. Grief over her own mother. The pressure of raising a child. The simple fact that she and I were different people. But that broken glass ended every excuse I had ever made. She had not been helping me. She had been isolating me, draining me, and rehearsing the story she would tell the world about a confused old man who needed to be taken care of. Before I tell you what I uncovered in the weeks that followed, let me ask you something, and I truly want your answer in the comments. If this had happened to you, Would you have confronted them that very night, in front of everyone? Or would you have stayed silent and quietly gathered your proof? Subscribe for more stories where patience turns betrayal into justice, and tell me which kind of person you are. The warning signs I realized on that drive had been there for years. I had simply refused to read them. It began small, the way these things always do. Vanessa started canceling my Sunday afternoons with Lily, saying I overstimulated her, that the child came home cranky and would not sleep. Then she redecorated the nursery and quietly threw away the wooden rocking horse I had carved by hand the winter Lily was born, the one I had sanded smooth over 6 weekends in my garage, because she said it did not match the new colors. I told myself it was just a toy. Then came the lake house, the little cabin where Eleanor and I had spent 30 summers, where I taught Bryce to fish off the dock. Vanessa convinced Bryce that I was too old to keep up the property, that the stairs were dangerous, that it should be put into his name for my own safety. I signed. God help me, I signed. Because my son sat across the kitchen table and told me he was worried about me. And I wanted to believe my boy still loved me more than he feared his wife. There was one afternoon I have never been able to shake. I had brought Lily a small box of strawberries from the farmer's market, the way I always did, and I left them on the kitchen counter while I went to wash my hands. When I came back, the box was gone, and when I asked about it, Vanessa tilted her head at me with a look of soft, performed concern and said, "Walter, you didn't bring any strawberries. You told us last week the market made you tired and you stopped going." I stood there in that kitchen and felt the floor tilt under me. Because I knew I had bought them, the receipt was still folded in my coat pocket. But she said it so kindly, so certainly, with Bryce nodding along beside her, that for one terrible second I doubted my own memory. That was the thing she was best at. She did not argue with the truth. She simply replaced it gently again and again, until I started to wonder whether the man in my own mirror could be trusted. Later that evening, I found the strawberries in the trash, tucked under a paper towel, untouched. By then, I had already apologized to her for being confused. There were other moments, smaller, sharper. The Thanksgiving she rearranged the seasoning so I was at the far end, away from Lily. The way conversations stopped when I walked into a room. The time I overheard her on the phone in the laundry hallway saying, "He won't even remember he said it." The bank statements that started arriving with charges I did not recognize, which I assumed I had simply forgotten making. Because she had spent 2 years teaching me to doubt my own memory. Each piece, taken alone, was nothing. A toy, a staircase, a seat at a table. But laid side by side on that long, dark highway, they formed a single picture. And the picture was a cage, and I had helped build it one polite surrender at a time. That night, when I finally got home, I did the first brave thing I had done in years. I called Diane Mercer. Diane had handled the sale of my company a decade earlier. And she was the kind of attorney who used 10 words where other lawyers used 100. It was nearly midnight, but she answered. And she listened without interrupting. While I told her about the glass, the word confused, the canceled visits, the lake house, and the charges I could not explain. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then she said something that changed the shape of everything. "Walter, I think your daughter-in-law has been doing a great deal more than humiliating you, and I want you to write down every single dollar you have given that family, starting tonight before you sleep." She gave me 3 instructions before she hung up. Change every password on every account I owned. Do not contact Bryce or Vanessa, not a call, not a text, not a word. And trust no explanation that arrived without paper to back it up. Then she told me she would drive out the next afternoon and bring someone with her. The someone was a forensic accountant named Grant Holloway, a quiet, heavy-set man who carried 2 laptops and a habit of saying almost nothing until he was certain. The 3 of us sat at my dining table for 6 hours straight. Diane spread out my trusts, my deeds, my account statements, my old tax filings. Grant asked for logins to accounts I had not opened in years, accounts I had handed over to Bryce to manage because I trusted him and because it felt good, once, to let my son take care of something for me. Coffee went cold in 3 different mugs. The afternoon light moved across the table and disappeared. And at some point, Diane slid a thick retainer agreement in front of me and put her pen on top of it, but she did not let me sign right away. She looked at me over her glasses.
"Walter," she said, "once we start pulling these threads, we cannot pretend we never saw what comes loose. If Bryce is involved, and I think he may be, this will not just end his career. He could lose his license to practice law. He could go to prison. Are you certain you want me to look in every room?"
I thought about Lily's small hand stretched back toward me over her father's shoulder. I thought about the rocking horse in a landfill somewhere. I picked up the pen and signed every page. "Find everything," I told her. "Do not leave a single room closed." By the time the sun came up, 11 pages of a yellow legal pad were filled in my own handwriting, line after line of money I had given and half forgotten. Writing them down was its own kind of grief. Each entry was a moment I had chosen to trust over a moment I should have questioned, and seeing them stacked one on top of another was like watching a slow robbery play back in fast motion. $75,000 for a real estate deal Vanessa had described in glowing detail, and that, I now realized, I had never seen a single document for. $40,000 to launch her wellness brand, a chain of fitness studios that had quietly folded, a down payment on a Range Rover, 2 vacations for her parents, church donations made in my name to a congregation I had never set foot in, and dozens upon dozens of what she always called small loans, $2,000 here, $5,000 there, never repaid, always urgent. When Grant finally added it all together, the number was more than $400,000 in 3 years, and he warned me, gently, that this was only the money I could remember. The rest, he said, we will have to go and find. Then came the silence. For 21 days, I heard nothing from my son, no call to ask whether the cut had healed, no message, no apology, nothing at all. What I did hear, through an old friend at the country club, was that Bryce was telling people I had suffered a small stroke at the party, that I was being evaluated for memory loss, and that the family was being so patient with me. He was salting the ground before they planted me in it, and then, on the morning of the 22nd day, my phone rang at 6 o'clock. It was Grant, and his voice was different. "Walter," he said, "sit down. You are going to want to be sitting down for this." Vanessa had been forging my signature for more than 2 years. Not occasionally, systematically. She had opened a line of credit against my Wilmington home, the house I had paid off 2 decades ago, using a signature that was almost mine but not quite, the loop on the W slightly wrong. She had used my name to personally guarantee the debts of her failing fitness studios so that when they collapsed, the creditors would come for me. And she had moved $62,000 into a shell company registered in Delaware, a company whose only listed officer was her cousin, a man Grant had already found connected to a wire fraud complaint in another state. She had not done it all at once. She had done it slowly, patiently, one forged page at a time. A thief who understood that a small theft repeated for years is safer than one large theft noticed in a moment. She had stolen from me the same way she had isolated me, quietly, and on the assumption that the confused old man would never ever look. But Vanessa was not the worst of it. The worst of it had my son's name on it. Grant had traced a second trail, and this one led straight into the trust I had created for Lily. Years earlier, I had set aside money for my granddaughter's future and named Bryce as a co-trustee. Because what grandfather does not want his son standing guard over his grandchild's inheritance? For 18 months, Bryce had been draining it. He had approved payments to a private school Lily had never attended. He had approved invoices from a tutoring service that did not exist. And the money had flowed, again and again, into the same Delaware shell company Vanessa was using. Some of the disbursements carried my signature too, because I had sat at their Sunday table and signed papers my own son slid in front of me, telling me they were routine, telling me not to worry about the details. Grant followed the money out of Lily's trust, through 3 accounts, and into a beach condominium on the Florida coast, purchased outright and titled entirely in Vanessa's maiden name. They were not only robbing me, they were robbing their own 7-year-old daughter, and they were using my trembling, trusting signature to make every dollar of it look legal. I will not lie to you. There was a part of me, sitting in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and the dawn coming up gray over the water, that wanted to drive 3 hours straight to their door and break it down. Diane talked me off that ledge. She moved instead with a cold, surgical patience that I came to admire more than anything I had seen in years. She quietly removed Bryce from every trust and document she had the authority to change. She transferred control of Lily's inheritance to an independent fiduciary, a neutral professional who answered to no one in my family. She locked down what remained of my own assets behind freezes and alerts. And every instinct I had screamed at me to confront them, to call Bryce, to scream the truth into the phone. Diane stopped me every time with the same sentence. Predators run when they sense the trap closing, Walter. So we are going to let them keep believing they have already won. And so for 4 months, that is exactly what I did. I became on purpose the frightened old man they had decided I was. I called Lily every single afternoon at the same time, 4 o'clock, when she got home from school, and Vanessa allowed it because in her mind those calls were proof that I was harmless, lonely, and very nearly finished. I told her I had been resting on doctor's orders. I let her hear a small tremble in my voice when I said goodbye. Some nights, after those calls, I sat alone in the dark of my kitchen and felt the shame of pretending to be weak in front of a woman who had cut my face open, and I had to remind myself that this was not weakness. This was a man laying a trap and refusing to spring it early. Diane called it the hardest kind of patience there is. The patience to let someone keep hurting you a little longer because you understand that the only way to truly stop them is to let them finish convincing themselves they have already won. And while she counted the days until she could move the last of my money and complete her story, I planned a dinner. My 72nd birthday was coming. I rented a private room at a historic inn, the kind of place that impresses people who care about being impressed, and I sent invitations to the exact circle whose opinion Vanessa valued most, Bryce's senior law partners, her pastor, a food critic she had been trying to befriend for a year, a state senator I had known since we were both young men. The invitation promised a family acknowledgement, and Vanessa, who had spent 3 years waiting for me to surrender, read those 2 words exactly the way I knew she would. She replied within the hour. "We are so proud of you, Walter." She believed she was coming to watch me hand over the keys to everything. She had no idea she was walking into a courtroom that simply did not have a judge in the chair. The morning of the dinner, while caterers set tables and a string player tuned in the corner, I was somewhere else entirely. I was in a courthouse with Diane, sitting on a hard bench, waiting. We had filed for emergency temporary guardianship of Lily, on the grounds that both of her parents were actively stealing from her trust and were preparing, according to a tip Grant had developed, to move what little remained. A judge reviewed the evidence Diane had assembled, the forged signatures, the phantom school, the Florida deed, and granted the order that same afternoon. By the time I stood at the head of that table in my good gray suit, with a small fading scar above my eyebrow, Lily was already legally beyond Vanessa's reach. A court-appointed guardian had her safe in a side room of the inn. A sheriff's deputy in a plain jacket stood quietly near the entrance with a folder of documents he was there to deliver before the night was over. Vanessa arrived in pearls, kissed the air beside my cheek, and smiled like a woman who had already counted her winnings. After the dessert plates were cleared, I rose and tapped my glass, and the room went politely quiet. I thanked everyone for coming. I spoke for a few minutes about Eleanor, my wife, gone now 11 years, and about a scholarship foundation I intended to start in her name to send rural kids to college. Vanessa watched me with shining eyes and the warmest expression she had ever aimed in my direction, certain that the next words out of my mouth would be the transfer of my estate into her careful hands. And then I said, very simply, "Tonight I would like to acknowledge what my family has actually been doing." The temperature of the room changed in an instant. On a quiet cue, 2 members of the inn's staff moved down the long table, setting a slim navy binder in front of every single guest. I watched the law partners open theirs. I Inside each binder were the forged signatures laid beside my real one, the loop on the W wrong every time, the credit line against my home, the guaranteed debts, the payments out of Lily's trust to a school she had never attended, and the deed, the Florida deed, with Vanessa's maiden name typed across it in clean black letters. Bryce went the color of paper. Vanessa's smile froze on her face like something painted there, and in that moment, finally, she understood that the confused old man she had mocked for 3 years had spent 4 quiet months building something she could not talk her way out of. She stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "Walt," she said, and her voice had a brittle laugh in it. "Walt, stop this. This is all some kind of misunderstanding." For the first time in 3 years, I looked directly into her eyes without a trace of fear in my chest. "My name," I said quietly, "is Walter." Behind me, a small projector lit the wall, and the image of the Florida condominium appeared. The property bought with money stolen from a child, titled in her name alone. One of Bryce's law partners set down his binder, stood, and walked out of the room without a word. The senator was no longer smiling. The pastor stared at the table, and Vanessa's face changed as she felt it happen, felt the entire room stop seeing the elegant wife and devoted mother she had spent years performing, and start seeing exactly what the binder showed them she was. Then my son began to cry, not the practiced tears I had seen him use on juries and on me. Real ones, ugly and silent, the kind that come from somewhere a person cannot control. He looked up at me and he said one word, "Dad." And for just a moment, against everything in me, I saw the little boy I had taught to fish off that lake house dock, the boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder in the truck. But I did not let that memory undo what the man he had become had done. I told him, in front of everyone, that he had exactly one chance left. If he told the whole truth that night, every piece of it, he might one day earn his way back into his daughter's life. If he lied to me one more time, I would hand every binder in that room to the authorities and let the law decide what was left of his career and his freedom. Bryce lowered his head and nodded, and then I turned toward a door at the side of the room. "There is someone," I said, "that the two of you need to see." The side door opened, and Lily stepped through it holding the guardian's hand. The instant she saw me, she let go and ran, the same way she had run across that other room with blood on my face, except this time no one carried her away. She hit me at full speed and wrapped both arms around my legs. Vanessa lurched out of her seat toward her daughter, but the sheriff's deputy stepped smoothly between them and told her, in an even voice, to please remain where she was. Lily looked up at me with those enormous eyes and asked if she was going to stay with me that night. I told her yes. "Yes, sweetheart, you are." And then she turned her head, looked across the silent room at her mother and said, in the clear and merciless honesty that only a 7-year-old can manage, "Mommy, you shouldn't have hit Grandpa." Not one person in that room drew a breath. What happened after that night did not happen quickly, the way it does in stories. Real justice grinds slowly, but it came. 4 months later, after the forensic trail Grant had built proved impossible to deny, Vanessa pleaded guilty to 23 separate charges, including wire fraud, identity theft, and theft from a minor's trust. She was sentenced to a stretch in prison long enough that Lily will be most of the way grown before she walks free. Bryce surrendered his license to practice law rather than be stripped of it in front of the bar. He admitted, in writing, his role as a co-conspirator, but on the night of that dinner, when I gave him his one chance, he had taken it. He handed investigators his phone, his office files, his private accounts, and every message in which Vanessa had instructed him to delete something. Because his cooperation cracked the whole scheme open and helped recover a meaningful part of Lily's stolen money, he was sentenced to probation instead of prison. His career was finished. His marriage was finished. His name, in the town where he had built it, was finished. He moved into a small apartment across the city and took a job behind the counter at a hardware store. At first, the court allowed him to see Lily only under supervision. Later, slowly, that opened into limited weekends, and he began to call me every Sunday afternoon, the way he had stopped doing years before. Lily came to live with me in the house by the water, in a bedroom with a window that looks out over the gray-green Sound. She went back to school. She caught the bus at the end of my long driveway every morning, lunchbox swinging. And little by little I heard her laugh again, that loud, surprised laugh she used to have before she learned to be careful in her own home. It did not all heal at once. For the first few weeks she would hide food in her room. Crackers and granola bars tucked under her pillow, the way frightened children sometimes do when they have learned the world is not safe. And the first time I found them, I had to step out onto the porch so she would not see her grandfather cry. The lake house came back to me in the legal settlement, and the first thing I did was track down the old plans and have her wooden rocking horse rebuilt, every curve the same as the one I had carved the winter she was born. She named it Biscuit. On the nights when bad dreams pull her up out of sleep, she pads down the hall, climbs onto Biscuit, and rocks slowly in the dark until the fear lets go of her and she can go back to bed. Of everything that came out of those long months, that quiet creak of wood in the dark is the victory that matters most to me. The foundation in Eleanor's name opened that fall. In its first year, it helped 41 students from families like the one Eleanor came from, families with more pride than money, get themselves to college. I am proud of that. But the change that mattered happened inside my own walls. Lily started sleeping through the night. Bryce kept calling every Sunday, and somewhere in those awkward, painful conversations he began, slowly, to understand a thing it had cost him everything to learn. An apology is only a sound until it is followed by changed behavior, week after week, with nothing asked in return. And I came to understand something of my own. Something I want you to hear clearly. I did not destroy Vanessa's life. I did not ruin my son. I simply stopped standing between them and the consequences of their own choices. Every forged signature was hers. Every stolen dollar was theirs. All I did, in the end, was turn on the lights and let the truth stand in a place where everyone could finally see it. I learned something hard about my son in all of this, and I will carry it the rest of my days. Bryce did love me, I believe that. But when the moment came, he chose silence over courage because silence was easier. And he told himself that staying quiet was a way of keeping the peace. It was not. His silence did not protect our family. It handed Vanessa the room to hurt every one of us, including his own child. Love that will not act is not really love at all. It is only a feeling, and feelings did not protect Lily. Bryce had to lose almost everything he had before he understood that. Now every Sunday phone call is one more chance for him to become, at last, the man he always had the ability to be. A few months ago, on one of those calls, he asked me a question I did not expect. He asked whether I thought Lily would ever forgive him. I told him the truth. I told him that forgiveness was not something he could earn with a sentence or a tear, that it would come, if it came at all, from 1,000 small Sundays of showing up when there was nothing in it for him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's fair, Dad." And for the first time in years, I believed he actually meant it. If you are listening to this and you are being worn down by someone cruel, someone who tells you that you are too old, too tired, too forgetful, or too alone to fight back, I want you to hear me. Protect your mind. Protect your dignity. Protect whatever strength you still have, even if it is only a thread. Do not let dishonest people convince you to become dishonest, or frightened, or small. Do not surrender your own judgment just because someone keeps telling you, softly and often, that you have lost it. I was 71 years old the night Vanessa cut my forehead open in front of a room full of strangers, and 72 the night I set the truth down in front of every person she had ever tried to impress. My age never made me powerless. Patience made me powerful. Preparation made me powerful. And the simple, late-arriving courage to stop making excuses gave me back my entire life. These days, when I sit on my porch in the evening and watch the sun go soft and orange over the water, I no longer feel like a confused old man waiting for the world to take him away. Upstairs, Lily is asleep, safe, with a wooden horse standing guard beside her bed. Vanessa built her own ruin, plank by plank, over years, and all I ever did was refuse to keep hiding it from the daylight. The greatest revenge was never the prison sentence, or the lost law license, or the shame in front of all those important people. The greatest revenge was reclaiming my own name, keeping my granddaughter safe, and proving, to myself most of all, that when a patient man finally wakes up, there is no one on this earth who can put him back to sleep. I am 73 now, and I have finally come to understand that justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is not a courtroom or a confession or a binder full of proof at all. Sometimes it is only this: a child sleeping safely upstairs. A house that feels like peace, and a name that no one will ever take from you again. If this story stayed with you, do me a kindness and tell me in the comments. Would you have stayed silent and gathered your proof the way I did? Or would you have confronted them the very first night? And subscribe to the channel for more true-to-life stories about betrayal, quiet courage, and the kind of justice that finally lets a person breathe again.